Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our April edition of our online talks. It's lovely to see you here, especially because I know that some of you were recently at the Castle Studies Group annual conference, so good to see that you're not already castled out for the week. So we have a very exciting talk coming up from Duncan Berryman about castles and the agricultural buildings within them. It's a topic which definitely needs some attention, is I think perhaps quite easy to overlook, and it reminds me a bit of the talk we had last year to do with horses at castles and how that's an area for research as well. So there's an awful lot of potential here, and especially in looking at some of the variety of roles at castles. So I think that's enough from me. I think we're also familiar with how this will work in terms of questions at the end. You're welcome to keep your video on during this talk. It's being recorded, but the focus will be on Duncan. And do try and remain muted if you can. So I think that's plenty from me. Duncan, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, so yeah, Richard invited me to give this talk a wee while ago. It's kind of based on my PhD research, which was looking at 14th century agricultural buildings in England, and then developing that a bit more to a wee bit of research that the Castle Studies Trust asked me to write a wee blog last year, looking at specifically more castles. So I've developed this out a bit to sort of think a wee bit more about castles, their association with agricultural buildings, manorial sites and settlements, and looked a bit at England and then a wee bit more at Ireland, because I've tried to spend a wee bit more time looking at Ireland after focusing on England for my PhD. So I'll sort of start off giving you a bit of overview of my doctoral research into manorial sites and their agricultural buildings, and then we'll move on to castles and sort of the Irish examples towards later on in the talk. So manorial sites come in quite different, quite a range of forms. You've got everything from sort of the moated sites, which are quite typical, enclosures, courts of buildings. And here you can see one of the few examples of an excavated site of the Manor of Chalgrove in Oxfordshire, and it is a classic moated site with a garden to the side, and it's got organised quite clearly into sort of domestic area to the north, and then a separate agricultural courtyard to the south, with the barn and the animal housing enclosing that, with two entrances, one through to the central courtyard accessing domestic area, and then a southern entrance for the agricultural buildings, obviously to try and keep the main courtyard clear of any debris and muck that the carts would bring in. And then other manorial sites we find are just really enclosures of buildings. So here we've got the Temple Preceptory of South Witham in Lincolnshire, and Alceston, which I've done a wee bit of work on for my PhD and recently published in the Sussex Archaeological Journal. And these were not moated enclosures, so they're just courts of buildings. In Alceston, we've got this surviving barn here on the right hand side, is late, well, post-medieval, but with sort of late medieval elements to it, probably sitting on the site of the medieval barn, and then the purple hole in the centre of the courtyard, and the dovecot, both which have medieval remains in them. and then other sort of animal buildings forming the rest of the courtyard. South Witham, the domestic complex here is highlighted in red, with the kitchens to the right-hand side in white, and then the agricultural buildings in yellow, which the excavators have described as barns, but clearly there's more buildings than just barns there, because there must be animal housing. These buildings to the top corner were suggested to be pigsties, but I suspect there's also stables, ox houses as well within these. So we've got quite a range of different types, and quite often with different courts organising the buildings and keeping the domestic buildings and the animal houses and crop storage quite separate. Although we do find that quite often the agricultural buildings are placed in front of the domestic buildings. So as you approached the halls, you would obviously see the barns, the ox houses, the stables, before you actually reach those domestic buildings, suggesting that maybe there was an important symbolism within this, within these buildings and their positioning within these complexes. To look more closely at the buildings, obviously barns are the most common survival. Many of these that do survive are the Great Stone Barns, such as Bredon and Great Coxwell here. A lot of the stone barns were built by the church, by the abbeys and monasteries, as these perpetual institutions, that they saw these stone barns would survive. But there's many examples also of timber barns that have survived from the Middle Ages. I think Harmsworth and Lee Court are significant timber barns that also survive. There's also, I always think of these as being for crop storage primarily, which they were, but they had many other functions as well. And there's evidence of them being used for holding the manor courts, for gatherings. They've been used for storing the farming equipment. And in the accounts and some descriptions, you often find, like, they talk about the barley barn, the wheat barn, particularly at Cressing Temple. We think of the barley barn and the wheat barn. But there's also a lot of evidence for multiple crops being stored within these. So certain bays would have been used maybe for peas, one for wheat, one for oats. So we have to think of them as very much multifunctional buildings and very large storage facilities as well. And the main reason these survive are that the sheer investment in materials and their construction. There would have been a huge expense to the manor, and therefore it makes sense to reuse them, repurpose them. If you look at Great Coxwell, you can see the original porch sticking out there, but in the gable walls, it's had very large doors inserted for modern machinery to access the barn, so it could continue to be used and survive, because you wouldn't want to have to rebuild such a large building when it was still functional. Animal housing is the other part of the manor, and very, very few animal houses actually survive. That's mainly because they were timber. Most animal houses were timber framed, straw thatch on the roofs. Occasionally you get stone built, some stone built buildings with slate roofs, but those are really quite exceptional. The typical depiction of a sheep house is from the Duke of Berry's Book of Hours here, on the top left, and this quite reflects what Chris Dyer surveyed in Gloucestershire. These long, narrow buildings with single entrance or double entrance sometimes. But the manorial accounts suggest that these probably are a lot less substantial than what we actually find. Maybe more reflective of European buildings, whereas in England, sheep houses were certainly had wall sills, had doorways, had windows. You could lock the door and keep the sheep in. They're certainly a lot more substantial than the Duke of Berry's depiction there, which may be a lot more like these sort of wicker hurdles at the Folk Museum in Europe. And then with the things like ox houses and stables, we quite often find very similar descriptions as for the sheep houses. So they were also sort of timber built. Sometimes stables may have also been clad with planks or timbering just to protect them from the horses. But it would be hard to tell that from archaeological examples. One example that does often survive, I always thought quite unusually, is the dovecot. As you said, at Old System, the dovecot survives. It's a rectangular building, kind of. It's been altered quite a lot, but there's an awful lot of stone. These circular stone dovecots survive, such as the one at Kinwarton in Warwickshire and Cosmoston, excavated in Glamorgan. Generally the stone dovecots were circular with pigeon holes on the inside, and then possibly with a revolving ladder, or just with a ladder that was carried around. Timber frame dovecots did exist, but quite rarely survive now to modern times. But they would have been square, much more square shaped than these stone examples. Dovecots are massively expensive to construct, particularly when they're stone. Say a typical dovecot, one example anyway, from Wellow in Somerset, cost far more to build a stone dovecot than a massive timber barn would have at the same period. So this was really a huge investment to build this for the pigeons, which are relatively small and insignificant animals. So I spent part of my PhD thinking about why such an investment, and we know that there's sort of the manorial privilege of owning doves, that only the Lord could keep a dove. But then the other side of that is whenever you have poaching, would become quite common, and the act of poaching the doves and the pigeons from these dovecots becomes an attack on the Lord's authority. So construction of stone dovecots reduces the poaching and protects the doves. But it also acts as a symbol of the Lord's authority. So at Old System, you would have seen the dovecot as you approached the manor, and you could have seen, you've been able to see that building and know the wealth of the Lord who's living there. I've also noticed that dovecots tend to only be found on manors where the Lord is quite often present. So not only have you got the expense of building the dovecot, but you've also the expense of keeping the pigeons, as they would eat the crops and could damage the thatching of the buildings and cause quite a lot of loss of crops and materials. So manors really only built and kept doves where the Lord was present and quite often eating the doves, so they needed to be there. So to move on to the castles, then I looked at during lockdown. I spent a wee bit of time looking at some of the castles from more from a literature review point of view, using things like the history of the king's works and excavation reports that I have access to and things, just to see what sort of buildings were within castles. It won't be any surprise to any of you that stables were the most common. Obviously, they're agricultural, but they've got a much more of a domestic association, as horses would have been used by lords and people visiting the castles and living in the castles. But we also find plenty of dovecots and several barns and granaries as well. So that there was a lot more agricultural buildings within the castles of England. They probably are unlikely to function quite the same as they did in rural, but they've been rural manorial centres, because obviously the rural manors, the crops are being grown on the land and being brought in and stored, whereas the castles are probably being used to house things for the household a lot more. But it does remind us that there were some agricultural processes being carried out within castles. So stables were obviously used for housing the riding horses, the lord and the king and their entourage, but they'd also have been used to house the cart horses used by the castle and the staff, bringing in goods to the market, carrying goods out around the place wherever it was needed. We find records of stables at Hereford and Leeds, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and as pictured here, the stables at Kenilworth are still extant. The dovecot was an important source of food from the young doves, the squabs. We find a dovecot at Dorchester, another identified South Witham, or southwest tower of Boddingham. The existence of barns might suggest that sheaves of wheat and barley were being brought into the castle and threshed there to provide grain for the flour, and would also have provided straw for the stables and possibly for the floors around the castle. The example of Pontefract, we've got, there's evidence of the Outer Bailey was described as a garden or a farm in accounts from 1356. So that's the area outlined in black here, was the Outer Bailey. So obviously it was being, if it was being described as a farm or garden, it's obviously being considered a bit more agricultural rather than just storage. And it's said that it have included the Great Barn and a granary and also stables as well. We've also got evidence for barns at Acton Burnell, Bamburgh, Hadley, Woolley, and a lovely example from Headingham Castle. So in about 1610, this plan of the castle was drawn up, and here we can see in this sort of outer courtyard, you can see it says the stable and the barnyard. And barnyards quite often be terming of an enclosure of barns, slightly more than just maybe a single barn. I think might also say granary in this area. So clearly there's the outer court is being used as a sort of an agricultural complex beside the main castle. And a slightly more unusual example is at Clare Castle in Suffolk, where the 1325 accounts for the constable indicates that within the outer enclosure of the castle compound there was a pigsty and a poultry house. Now I'm not quite sure exactly where within the castle complex, but I suspect somewhere within this larger area, there was a pigsty, possibly to be feeding the waste. Quite often the waste of malting houses was fed to the pigs, and then used as a source of food for the household. Also, when I was putting this together, I noticed this field is been called Horsecroft, which might have some indication of a horse stud, or some sort of horse activity anyway, although I couldn't find any evidence of that in the accounts. So moving to the Irish examples. Now I have been able to find some evidence of agricultural buildings within English larger castles, but unfortunately for the Irish examples, I haven't yet been able to come across any evidence that there was buildings within the larger enclosures. However, Ireland has particularly high density of castles and fortified sites. So everything from the great baronial site of Trim to motts, tar houses, and other moated sites. Many of these castles were manorial centres and would have had agricultural buildings associated with them. And this was most clearly seen in the motts. The Mott and Bailey castles occasionally had associated families and enclosures which contain agricultural buildings. The documentary record of Cloncurry in County Kildare provides clear evidence, with the extents record that beside the mott was an old haggard close or farmyard in which there were two small granges or barns, each of 8 forks, presumably cruck blades or trusses, so probably 9 bays long or 7 bays, depending on which way they're measuring it. There is also there, beside the gate, an ox house, and there is a dovecot. So here we can see a recreation or an interpretation of the haggard or the farmyard. So we have the mott with tar on it, the hall, and you can see they've put in cruck blades in the roof of the hall. And then there's an ox house and a dovecot and a barn, which would have been something similar to the ox house there. So we can see from modern today, this would be just a grassy mott would survive, but clearly there was a lot of buildings surrounding it. There's also a record of a barn with 10 forks at Castlemore in Carlow, as well as a mill and other timber buildings. And if the barn here at Cloncurry, if it was 9 bays long, using a sort of typical size of a bay, we could end up with something the same sort of size as Breedon barn, which I showed you earlier. So quite a substantial barn was located here within this farmyard. Also the example of Callan Mott in County Kildare, where we have a raised enclosure with the domestic buildings within it, and then the courtyard beside that with the barn, stables, and the ox house, and then the outer bailey with access to the domestic the settlement further afield. At Loch Mearns in Kilkenny, the mott sat on a promontory fort in the lake with an associated bailey containing a granary, stables, and a sheepcot. When at Inch, in Tipperary, there's a granary and a sheepcot beside the mott, and other buildings included stables, a fish house, and a dovecot and a malt kiln within the surrounding area. So these examples all show that Irish castles play an important role as manorial settlements and manorial farms within their wider estate. Alongside the domestic and military buildings were the functional farm buildings, which are very similar to the manorial complexes that I discussed earlier. And these combined aspects of lordly authority with display of and the mundane buildings that were essential for the management of the estate. This suggests that a significant number of the manors were fortified as castles. Of the 107 memorial extents surviving from Ireland with information about buildings, 26 described the chief residence as a castle, suggesting that a significant number of these manors were actually fortified rather than the more open plan in England, and possibly developed into later castles. Some of these were the Wat and Bailey castles, as you see here at Clock, while others were stone towers, masonry curtain walls. Occasionally a stone tower may have been added to an earlier Wat and Bailey, such as this example in County Down, and the perceived need for defence may have been carried over from an earlier period, but it continued with the construction of tower houses in the 15th and 16th centuries. So today, many tower houses are found within active farmyards, such as Athclare here in the top right, Kilcool and Louth, and Newcastle and Westmeath, and the example of Castle Ward here on the left-hand side. In Castle Ward, the ground level had actually been lowered, so you can see the doorway is much higher than the current ground level. So the farmyard was lowered in the 18th century, and the tower was left in this artificial hill. Many modern farm buildings are likely to have replaced earlier buildings on similar footings, in particular when a new farmhouse were constructed in front of the farmyard to replace the tower house as the residential building, as we move into the post-medieval ideas of the model farm. However, many modern tower houses are now isolated from modern settlement, and without geophysical survey or excavation, it would be difficult to know what was surrounding these buildings. About a quarter of tower houses were surrounded by a bawn wall, creating an enclosure which would have housed both domestic and agricultural buildings. An example such as Audley's Castle here was good evidence of the hall in front of the tower house, and then space in the bawn for presumably agricultural buildings, probably stables, but there could also have been a small barn and other storage buildings. And would also then provide protection for cattle, which could have been brought inside to protect against any raiding in the area at the time. The bawn of Barry's Court Tower House was extensively excavated and revealed a large domestic range and ornamental gardens to this area to the north of the tower house, with quite a large domestic hall and chambers, quite nice ornate gardens laid out. But the eastern part of the barn has the remains of the modern farm buildings, which Pollock believes would have replaced the earlier agricultural buildings. And unfortunately, this area wasn't excavated because of the current standing buildings. Recently, McAllister has noted that castles such as Ardmale and Lisrochen both had haggards, granaries, gardens, and rabbit warrens. However, quite often the yards and gardens may not have been associated directly with the tar house. For example, with Ardmail, you can quite clearly make out some sort of marks within these fields, suggesting that there may have been burgage plots laid out, and therefore there may have been the agricultural buildings may have been slightly further away. And also with this room is quite close to the churchyard, so again it may be sitting on a site in a bit of a settlement, and then the agricultural centre is removed slightly further away. Michael O'Mahony, recently completed his PhD at Queen's, has shown that the 17th century civil survey of Ireland contains an awful lot of descriptions of tar houses with surrounding buildings which have not survived. So even since the 17th century, we've lost quite a lot of these buildings that were associated with tar houses and no longer are visible. However, there's an awful lot of work needs to be done. As Richard said at the beginning, we're only really scratching the surface of the buildings surrounding tar houses. Moving away from tar houses, we're looking at moated sites, and Kieran O'Connor has argued that certainly in Ireland these are defensive structures, clearly domestic structures, but with the moat is providing them a defensive feature, much as the Bon Wall does to a tar house. They're very common across Ireland, and quite often contain agricultural complexes alongside domestic buildings. They're very similar to the baileys associated with moats, providing enclosure for domestic and agricultural buildings. They appear to serve a similar function to the English moated sites, but have been interpreted as having a much more defensive feature. McDermott's is a very large moated site, and Crannog at Rockingham, which is sort of illustrated on the screen here. Excavations within the site have revealed the corn drying kiln, suggesting there was a much more agricultural function within the site rather than purely domestic, and maybe that this was the agricultural enclosure and the Crannog was the domestic habitation. Documents also describe the site as a market town. Thus, it's likely that there was farm buildings and particularly a barn and a granary within the site, as well as other possible commercial buildings. A better example is that of Cuilmurray in Wexford, which is a large moated enclosure located quite far away from the manorial centre, so it's not the centre of the estate, but a much smaller or a much more independent enclosure. The excavation revealed that there was a building in the western half. So there was a small building, but it had a very elaborate drawbridge, which is illustrated here, and the excavators then interpreted as a domestic habitation within one half, and the other half the animals, which they've shown here. However, it's probably likely that there was other buildings within this enclosure, since corn drying kilns were found next to the site, slightly off the manorial or the moated enclosure. Timber frame buildings would have left no trace if their sill plate was only set on top of the ground rather than being dug into the ground, or if it was built out of a wall of sods of turf bricks, thus there could have been a whole range of agricultural buildings, particularly animal houses, within this enclosure, which have been completely lost to the archaeological record, and have left no trace. So we can only, we're very much reliant on what has been excavated and recorded, and I'm sure the excavators did their very best, but whenever you're dealing with turf which doesn't survive, it's very difficult to be able to record. So very few moated sites have been fully excavated, and timber and cod buildings, I say, that are very much underrepresented within the archaeological record. So it's probably likely that Irish moated sites had much more parallels with their English counterparts than has been previously recognised. English moated sites are primarily associated with farming of the manor and surrounding lands, and they're rarely thought of as defensive. But the creation of a moated enclosure is always sort of seen in the terms of the display of the wealth and the status. The moated sites such as Coolamurray may also have been useful to keep livestock within the enclosure, which would have reduced the need for fences. But I think many moated sites in England we quite often find the moats surrounding domestic buildings, such as at Brockhampton here on the left, and Great Chalfield in Wiltshire. Quite often the moat surrounds the domestic buildings, and occasionally then we've examples like Chalgrove, where it's completely enclosed. So there's an awful lot of work to construct these moats around the buildings, and I think seeing them as purely symbols of wealth and status, maybe sort of underplaying them to a degree, and maybe we've sort of underestimated the violence in English society, but they're probably a defense against sort of theft and crime, more than just purely status symbol. Quite often the manorial sites that I studied the accounts for record purchase of locks and keys for every building, so that there's an awful lot of control of space, control of access to the agricultural buildings within the manorial complex. So I think to see the moat as purely symbolic is maybe underplaying its importance, and that there may be a slight defensive feature. And conversely, we probably overplay the violence of Irish society, and it may not be as much of a raiding, and there's many raiding parties as we think, and there's probably slightly more symbolic symbolism in the moated site in Ireland. So I think there's probably a bit more thinking about these sites, and thinking about all their features and functions as well. So to sort of think of some conclusions, agricultural buildings were found within many English and Irish castles, although they're mostly found in the larger mostly in larger castles. It's things like stables and storage buildings, like a barn or so, and they were often located away from the domestic complexes. So as we saw at Pontefract, it's on the edge, and Castle Hedingham, it's on the northern boundary, in the outer bailies of the castles. And quite often these are the areas that weren't excavated whenever sites were being excavated, such as Trim Castle. The excavations focused on that central tower, and those outer edges were left. So there's probably more of these buildings to be found in the future. Castles and fortifications of lesser lords in more remote areas quite often acted as manorial centres, and therefore they contained a wide range of agricultural buildings. As we saw, the Irish motte and bailies generally had the farm buildings within the bailey, or quite close proximity to the domestic area. And many tower houses had a farmyard separated from the tower and hall. Farm buildings were generally made from timber and thus leave little trace in the archaeology compared to the stone-built structures that we find elsewhere. Cob was a common building material in Ireland and leaves even less trace in the archaeological record, as it was only mud or sods that were placed on the ground to form the walls. Barns and stables were the most common farm buildings found within larger castles, but a much wider range of buildings such as ox houses and sheep houses have been identified at these smaller castle sites, as we've seen in the Irish examples. And hopefully this research has also helped to show the importance of the documentary and pictorial sources alongside archaeology, as it helps to illustrate quite a range of different buildings and their appearance.